The thread counter. They found Mira's empty crib on the morning of her 3rd birthday, a single silver thread coiled where she should have been sleeping. Only old May noticed the ring of reddish-brown mushrooms that had sprouted overnight around the house, their caps glistening like dried blood in the dawn light. The old woman took one look and began to weep. "The thread counter," she whispered. "She's been chosen." The mushrooms withered to dust by nightfall, but their perfect circle had marked the boundary between safety and something else. A threshold Mira had been carried across while the world slept. Years later, children would whisper that such rings still appeared before the thread counter claimed a child, but parents dismissed such tales. They planted salt and iron around their gardens anyway. Mira remembered nothing of being taken. She knew only the endless room of silver spools, the clicking of bone needles, and the thread counter herself. A creature whose fingers were long and sharp as sewing needles, whose hair writhed with loose threads of fate that hadn't yet been measured. "Such a short thread you have, little one," the thread counter had said, holding up Mira's life thread. It glowed weakly in the candlelight, barely reaching from one palm to the other. 5 years, perhaps 6. Such a shame. But we might be able to arrange something. That was 10 years ago. Now Mira sat among the spools of thread that contained every life in the village, measuring and cutting as the thread counter had taught her. Her own thread had grown longer, shimmering with an unnatural luster that made her sick to look at. Each extension had come with a price. The first bargain had been simple enough. Take a single year from her baby brother's thread to add to her own. He'd die at 79 instead of 80. Who would notice? The thread counter had smiled when Mira agreed, her needle teeth glinting. The second bargain was harder. 3 years from her best friend Elena. "She wastes time anyway," the thread counter had whispered. "Always daydreaming. You'll make better use of those years." Elena had fallen ill the next week, her vibrant spirit dimming just slightly. By the 5th bargain, Mira had stopped crying when she cut the threads. The thread counter praised her steady hands, of her precise measurements. "You're learning," she'd say, stroking Mira's hair with fingers that drew blood. "Soon you'll be ready for real work." The real work, Mira learned, was finding children like herself, the ones with short threads, and offering them choices. She would hold up their measly life threads and click her tongue in sympathy. "Such a shame," she'd say, just as the thread counter had said to her, "but we might be able to arrange something." Some children refused. Those were the lucky ones, though they didn't know it. They would live their brief, bright lives and depart with threads intact. But most said yes. They always said yes to the first bargain. Tonight, Mira held the thread of a young boy named Thomas. It was short, shorter than hers had been, 4 years at most. His parents would be devastated. She could almost hear his mother's weeping. "We can help him," the thread counter murmured from the shadows. "Teach him, as I taught you. He has such clever fingers." Mira looked at her own thread, now long and lustrous with stolen years. She remembered each bargain, each cut, each life shortened so hers could extend. She thought of Elena, who no longer daydreamed, of her brother, who seemed just slightly less alive than other children, of all the threads she'd measured and cut, each snip taking something precious from the world. She looked at Thomas's thread again, so thin, so fragile, then at the bone needles waiting on the table, sharp and eager. "Yes," she said finally, her voice like scissors closing. "Send him to me. I'll teach him everything I know." As she spoke, she felt another piece of her soul unravel, becoming just another thread in the thread counter's endless tapestry of borrowed time and broken promises. But that didn't matter now. She had years enough to spare, after all. And somewhere in the village, a young boy named Thomas dreamed of silver threads and endless tomorrows, not knowing that tomorrow would bring the first of many bargains, each one easier than the last. The thread counter watched from her web of stolen years, needle fingers plucking a satisfied melody on the strings of shortened lives. Another apprentice chosen, another soul slowly unspooled. The work would continue, as it had for centuries, measured out in threads of silver and strands of fate, one small bargain at a time. After all, time was the ultimate currency, and there would always be those desperate enough to pay the price.